both countries realize they have to work with each other basically on a co-equal basis. Each has leverage over the other. America's begun to realize that it cannot treat China as an inferior country.
I think the problem with the US-China relationship historically was that we talked about it being one that had an outsized global footprint, but we didn't really involve enough of the world.
Whenever China policy discussion comes up in the White House, Donald Trump is the dove in the room. He's the one that wants to do a deal. The others in the room are hawks.
Hello and welcome to In Focus. I'm G. Sampath. In today's world, relations between the United States and China are perhaps the most consequential of all bilateral ties. They are both economic superpowers, and their geopolitical footprints cover almost the whole planet. Naturally, the trade war between the two has affected economies around the world, troubling markets, disrupting supply chains, bringing more uncertainty than businesses are comfortable with. In this context, how do we understand the agreement that came out of the Trump-Xi meeting in South Korea? What are the concerns on the American and Chinese side going forward? And how do we understand Trump and then Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth referring to the meeting as a coming together of G2? A term that suggests the idea of an exclusive club with common interests. Today, we are joined by Max Baucus, a former US Senator who served as ambassador to China, and James Chau, President of the China-United States Exchange Foundation, or QCEF, based in Hong Kong. Ambassador Baucus and James Chau, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to In Focus, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sampath, very much. And James,
Thanks so much, Sampath. Great to see you, Ambassador Baucus.
So I wanted to start with you, Ambassador Baucus, by asking you, the biggest development in US-China relationship in the recent times is, of course, the meeting last week in Busan, South Korea, between President Trump and President Xi Jinping. And there was what everybody calls as a one-year truce, quote unquote, between the two countries in the trade war. So I just wanted to know, what is your assessment of the main takeaways from this agreement?
I think, first, the truce. That's better. They were good that we're having a truce. Second, I think fundamentally, the relationships changed between U.S. and China. By that, I mean, China essentially stood up to America. China decided it's going to work. That it's going to respect America, and more important than that, it's going to use its leverage. This leverage tends to be soybeans to some degree, but it's really rare earth. Use this leverage to get an agreement with the United States on, say, export controls and some other matters. But the main thing is that I think it showed both China and the United States and the world that China thinks it's a co-equal partner with the United States. And I think to some degree the United States is going to recognize that. The summit is it's historic. Essentially, both countries realize they have to work with each other basically on a co-equal basis. Each has leverage over the other. And that's a major change. Up to this point, to a large degree, the United States would look down on China, feel superior to China, be very critical of China, treat China as an inferior country. But now I think America has begun to realize that it cannot treat China as an inferior country. It's essentially a co-equal country. And I think that's good. That's good because it will engender mutual respect in the best sense of the term. Each have to respect the other more than it did previously. Now, who knows how long this is going to last? President Trump is known for his indecision, known for changing his mind. But still, at a general level, I think this is good news. The slight downside here is the United States and China might want to do deals for themselves, for the United States and for China, but at the expense of other countries, potentially India, potentially ASEAN. And I think that's a real concern that I would have if I were an Indian, or if I lived in an ASEAN country. But we'll see. Time will tell. it also depends very much on the details. There are a lot of broad agreements on rare earth and export controls and fentanyl and so forth, and soybean purchases. But it depends on the details to a large degree. How's all this going to play out? But I'll end where I began. I think it's good news because it shows that it tends to show, and it does show that each country will now have to respect the other and deal with the other on a, how can I say this, not only a respectful basis, but on a basis that we both realize that we have to get along together in this world. China's not going anywhere. China will always be there. America's not going anywhere. America will always be here. But now we got to start work maybe a little better with each other. Donald Trump tends to like to bully people. He bullies institutions in the United States. He bullies other countries, but he cannot bully China. And he cannot bully China because China feels it's strong enough to stand up to him. And I think that has gained some respect of China by President Trump.
Ambassador Baucus, I mean, it's very interesting. You made this point about President Trump realizing that he cannot bully China because I was just reading through the American media on this entire agreement, and one of the things which came out is what they call the taco factor. Trump always chickens out, or so to speak. So do you think that's a factor? Because people have been talking about this also to do with the certain personality of president rather than an objective factor at play.
I think it is a factor, no question. He changes his mind very frequently, and part of it, he says, is tactical. He begins with a very strong premise, a very strong statement to throw someone off balance, knowing he's going to back down. I don't know. But there's also another factor here. Trump's decision-making depends in part on who last talked to him. A good example is NVIDIA sales of very high-end chips to China. It looked like Jensen Huang, CEO of NVIDIA, was going to be able to sell his top-of-the-line chips to China. But then the hawks in the United States got to Trump and got Trump to back off on that and not agree to the potential sale. But it looked like Trump was leaning toward agreeing with NVIDIA early on. So that's a real risk here. What will Trump stay the course or not?
Right. That's a really interesting context, Ambassador Baucus. Thank you for that. And I wanted to move to you, James, for this broader contextualization of this agreement. There have been similar agreements in the past as well, which did not live up to their promise, between the US and China. So is there anything to suggest that this time things will be different, James?
Well, I think Sampath, today both sides have matured to a stage where there's a more sober and realistic assessment of the relationship as one of strategic competition. And this realism, I think, has the underpinning of a foundation where it can lead to more durable, albeit limited understandings in some way. I mean, when you look at what happened in South Korea, there was perhaps a more narrow scope of focus in terms of their discussions, but these are more actionable and these are more operable if you look at that in more detail. I think the key, though, is going to be whether the newly established working groups and communication channels are going to remain active and productive, as you just said. Is there going to be a lasting power and substance to this? But the focus is very much on process and crisis management, not just on the one-off deliverables that we've seen sometimes in the past. If these dialogues become institutionalized, and they become the bread and butter of a more consistent, more predictable, more solid US-China relationship, that's going to be good for everyone, no matter which administration is in power or not. And that can provide a buffer against future shocks that, of course, can always occur. I think what both leaders have are strong domestic imperatives to avoid future economic disruption. And there are disruptions in both of their domestic environments. This shared pragmatic need for economic stability, I think, provides an incentive and imperative for a stronger foundation for this truce when you compare it to previous, more politically abstract agreements. And I'd also say that skepticism is also warranted because the difference this time is going to be measured by concrete action, a reduction in military maneuvers, a pause perhaps on new major trade tariffs, and a genuine progress in the working level talks in those subcommittees, for example, that we spoke of over there. But I think the key message is that both sides have shown a commitment to working together despite the differences not only despite the differences, but even because of those differences. There are many obstacles, there are many challenges, there are many differences still ahead. But the reality is that the two countries are the two biggest economies in the world, and they're interlinked in so many ways, not just the economies, but the people who represent and humanize those economies, that they do need to work together, whether they may like that or not. And they also need to do this for the rest of the world who depend on both countries to tackle our problems. So more dialogue, whether through official or unofficial channels, is really the way forward. And, what I think, we can all agree on here is that people-to-people relations, not just the policies, not just at government level, is really critical to resolving this.
Thank you for that perspective, James. You're absolutely right. I think a stable relationship between the two biggest economic superpowers is absolutely vital for global stability as well. Now, coming back to the context of this trade war, Ambassador Baucus, President Trump has said that the U.S. has sort of managed to buy time for the world. It's not just about the United States, but the entire world now has an opportunity, perhaps, to sort of diversify from a dependence on China. In that sense, he's sort of projecting it as a win for the entire world and not just for the United States. So, but there is also a counter view which says that in this entire negotiation which have happened, the back and forth, tit for tat, tariffs and sanctions and so on, it is China that has been able to establish, quote unquote, escalatory dominance. And it's a term borrowed from military parlance, but it's been used in this context as well. So it has been able to establish this escalatory dominance over the US using one, of course, is the rare earths thing. The other is, of course, the soya beans purchase, which directly hits at President Trump's farm base as well. So what are your thoughts on this understanding?
Well, I don't like the term escalatory dominance. I think it's too strong. It's not really accurate and really should not be used because neither country is dominating over the other. And I don't know if there's much escalation toward dominance, one country over the other. My view, it's basically it's kind of bipolar. We're pretty much equal. James made a very good point about people and relationships between the United States and China. When I was serving as ambassador, we had a lot of visits by cabinet secretaries to come over and meet with their counterparts in China. Vice President Biden to come over. It's add to that. I said many cabinet secretaries had come over. There are lots of other meetings they call S&ED, strategic and economic dialogues. Those were helpful, but they were pretty much discontinued under the first Trump presidency. And it's very difficult to get them back now. It'll be interesting to see the degree to which they come back. If there are many more dialogues in the best sense of the term, that'll be a good indication that the two countries are starting to work better together. If we don't see any dialogues, that too is a indication that maybe things are not going to be a lot better, although we'd like it to be a lot better. I understand the earlier point about everybody working together. I hope that's true, but let's not forget there's still a lot of competition between U.S. and China. This is going to continue for a good period of time, and But I do think, I know I'm repeating myself, that that both countries are beginning to respect each other more than they have in the past. I think the South Korean summit, it's going to be written up as historic.
Right. I mean, I see your point, Ambassador Baucus, but here, of course, the context here is the economic dimension of the relationship. But when people talk about escalatory dominance, I think where they are coming from is also the broader geopolitical context. For instance, President Trump, when asked at a press conference, he said Taiwan never came up. I think that's an important point, that Taiwan never came up. There are also tensions over the South China Sea, the Ukraine war, and China's relationship with Russia. So in that context, I was just curious about your understanding.
Well, I'm not at all surprised that Taiwan did not come up. Both countries have essentially put Taiwan on the shelf. Deng Xiaoping put Taiwan on the shelf years ago with their Kissinger and Nixon. That's where it should stay. Strategic ambiguity, keep Taiwan on the shelf. Most Taiwanese, like the way it is. They like the status quo. And President Xi is a conservative man. He's not going to be rash in any action toward Taiwan. The United States doesn't really know much about Taiwan. We're thousands of miles away. We think we know a lot about Taiwan, but we really don't. So I'm not surprised at all that Taiwan did not come up. And it's I don't know. It's one thing. There's going to be a very interesting development next couple of months. It's going to bear on this relationship, and that's the United States Supreme Court is going to determine whether or not the Trump tariffs are legal. If they are determined not to be legal, that's going to have a dramatic effect on the relationship, U.S.-China. And my personal view is they are illegal. I was serving in the Congress when similar legislation was passed, and basically we in the Congress at that point believed that the president can enact tariffs on an emergency basis if national security is in danger, but that's not the real basis for these tariffs that Trump is imposing. These tariffs he's using as leverage to gain power over other countries that may not be related to trade. He's trying to raise some revenue to help pay for his tax bill. But that decision by the United States Supreme Court next couple of months is going to be a story. It's going to really make a big difference. Another factor in the U.S. is going to be midterms. We have congressional elections coming up next year about this time, and it is very possible that either the House or the Senate could not be in Republican control. If that happens, that's going to have a dramatic effect on President Trump's domestic policy as well as foreign policy. But if both houses stay Republican, then President Trump will basically still be almost an autocrat. He has so much power now in the United States. So there are two potential developments which could change the dynamics very considerably, and those are two.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Baucus. Those are really very important points from the domestic dimension, which do have a bearing on US-China relationship. Not many people talk about it. The Supreme Court dimension and the midterms, I think they are very critical as well. We'll come back to that in a bit. But before that, James, I wanted to ask you, as Ambassador Baucus has been saying and hinting at, there are also, structural differences between the two countries which stretch beyond the economic domain, and they're going to be around no matter how many subcommittees and working committees there are to sort of thrash out the differences. So in this context also, people would want to sort of reduce dependencies on China, and at the same time China has this issue of overcapacity and deflation and so on. So in this broader context where this is unfolding, what do you think are China's main concerns around this agreement?
I'm going to give you my best guess, Sampath. Obviously, I don't speak for China, nor does the foundation as an independent nonprofit, but through the lens that exposure gives me, what I think is that China is concerned that the US will continue to strengthen export controls and investment restrictions, both on semiconductors and also on artificial intelligence. With regards to Taiwan, though it didn't come up in this conversation in South Korea, the US, I think, will continue to enhance political military sort of linkages in that area, which Beijing still, at the end of the day, will always see as that core interest. As Ambassador Baucus says, there is a time and place, and there have been historic place markers where they put that to one side. And I think that, that is also a very pragmatic approach over here. The trend of decoupling, some would say that the US could continue to push de-risking strategies with allies, effectively creating a technological or economic bloc that excludes China. But the trade wars only accelerated China's long-term strategy of dual circulation, which ultimately, I believe, aims to reduce external dependencies and build self-sufficiency in critical technologies, and also to build that, at home as well. When we look at semiconductors, billions of dollars we're seeing are being poured into the domestic chip industry, despite the significant technological hurdles. In aerospace, the state-owned COMAC has become like a national symbol, a national champion for developing a homegrown alternative to long-relied models such as Boeing and Airbus. And so I think that the time port is going to be used to deepen this indigenous, innovative and innovation drive and diversify import sources, therefore reducing the vulnerability to future pressure. I think they saw this back in 2016, 2017, when those first rounds of trade disputes occurred. And I think they probably would have taken a lot of notes at that time to say, round two, what do we do this time differently? And that circulation that I spoke of is not just a strategy. I think it's a fundamental mind shift in some ways.
There's a real danger here, as I see it. I think that China clearly is trying to become more self-sufficient, no question. It's decoupling significantly, as is the United States. And it's very much disrupting supply chains around the world. That is almost the antithesis of what was of the premise of WTO when China entered the WTO, maybe, what was it, 2000, about 2000. The world is becoming more, how can I say this, less interdependent. They're closed. Countries are becoming more closed. They're taking care of themselves first more. It's unfortunate. There's less trust in the world today, and that's why different countries, U.S., China, are taking care of themselves first, much more than they have in the past, and much less willing to cooperate with other countries. And part of this is, I think, caused by modern technologies. It's the internet, social media, and so forth. It's accelerated by President Donald Trump with his America First, which is to some degree cuts off allies. It tends to cut off work with other countries. The irony here is that the tariffs that they agreed to in South Korea, United States tariffs, and China, the tariffs that they agreed to are lower than U.S. tariffs on other countries like Brazil. They're
like
allies.
India too.
Yeah, India as well. And that's not a good trend. It shows we're not working with our friends as much as we should.
Yeah, thank you for sort of bringing that up, because I was going to ask you. You've been an advocate of free trade in your political career. America has been too, and we've had this entire WTO rules-based system. But now, with all the tariff era, so to speak, starting, it is China which has been using rhetoric about free trade, whereas the United States under Trump has been talking of barriers and sanctions and so on and so forth. So, do you think we can now? Maybe can US and China now take the world back to the pre-punitive tariffs era, or is this now here to stay?
I don't know. I think it's going to be difficult. It's going to take time. Many Americans think China is the enemy. Many Americans think China wants to dominate not just Asia, but the world. Many Americans actually think that. When I am at a U.S. airport ready to come to America, someone asks me, "Where are you going, Max?" I'm going to China. Oh, they're very, are you going to be safe over there? It's going to be American public opinion. It's going to make it very difficult for that to change. It will change, however, to some degree, if President Trump, as a transactionalist, begins to be more dovish toward China compared with a lot of the hawks in the United States. Whenever China policy discussion comes up in the White House, Donald Trump is the dove in the room. He's the one that wants to do deals. The others in the room are hawks. They don't want to. And so it's essentially, it's ironic, but Donald Trump could help the relationship because he's so transactional. He wants to do deals with a lot of countries, key countries like Ukraine, Gaza, but especially with China.
Right, that's interesting to hear that Trump is the dove in the room when it comes to China. Yeah, that's very interesting. Now, I wanted to ask you. I mean, you referred to this earlier as well. That now there is this shift that the U.S. and China are co-equals. Now, it very interestingly, there was this term which was, I think, first used by Fred Bergstein, G2, in 2005. It has been used by President Trump and also the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Hegseth, referring to this meeting as a meeting of the G2. Now, G2 has this the symbolism of an exclusive club where, the two powers are on their own and they sort of carve out their own spheres of influence and you don't sort of disturb each other. Now, that is a matter of concern to countries like India, which might want some kind of check on a Chinese, whatever Chinese do in their domain, so to speak. So what are your thoughts on, is there a strategic shift in understanding geopolitics vis-a-vis China in the United States right now in terms of this whole G2 business?
Well, I do think it's possible that Donald Trump thinks he might want to do a deal with President Xi Jinping, and to some degree tend to have some kind of an understanding, if not control the world, at least have some influence on the world. The danger there is that is very transactional. It's not a rules-based agreement. Previously, American presidents, whether it's Biden or Bush or Obama, whomever, would want to reach an agreement based on first principles. By that I mean rules-based system, not transactional, not as transactional, as rule of law, independent judiciary, basically the rule of law. And the slight concern I have here is that if Trump and Xi do tend to work better together, that'll have an adverse effect on other countries. I saw recently the Prime Minister of Singapore lamented that the United States is leaving the world scene as the primary enforcer of a rules-based system. And it's creating a kind of a vacuum. And I think that was a pretty astute observation. And it's a vacuum that's going to be more transactional, less rules-based, less based on the norms that the United States helped put together at the end of World War II. And I think that's going to cause a lot of angst among many countries in the world today. Lots of opportunities, but also a lot of risks.
Right. James, would you like to share your thoughts on this particular aspect?
Yeah, I would. Sampath, when I think of the word G2, I do think of the word exclusivity, but I also think of the word of pushing other people out and keeping other people out of the global conversation. I think the problem with the US-China relationship historically was that we talked about it being one that had an outsized global footprint, that everything that these two countries did together would impact and shape the world, which is true. But we didn't really involve enough of the world. And that's why these forums like the ones we have coming up are critical, because we bring in countries like India to ensure that they are not just participants with seats at the table, but they're the co-architects, they're the co-pilots in this. And why do I think this is important? I think that diversity of ideas is important. But I think also quite simply the US and China need it. So it's not just an act of gesture or goodwill that we say to countries or people from countries like India, please come in and please take part, is actually, I think it comes with a bit of humble pie that we do need these countries now, because the government to government relationship has become so bad that it's spilled over into over-securitization of the relationship that has really hampered, limited, narrowed the scope for people to people relations, which at the end of the day, when you think back to 1971 and the advent of ping pong diplomacy, is what broke open and shattered the silence in a decade-long silence during the Cold War. So it wasn't necessarily the politicians at that time who took the lead. Yes, we had Dr. Kissinger meeting with Premier Chau. Yes, we had President Nixon going to Beijing and meeting with Chairman Mao. But it was really the people, the citizen diplomacy that opened that door. It was that creativity that reimagined what was then seemingly impossible. So I think G2 is a very dangerous road to go down, and I think that there needs to be some pushback on that. In terms of what you asked about pre-punitive tariff eras, I'm going to go a little bit further than Ambassador Baucus here and suggest that a full return to the hyper-globalized rule-based system of the pre-2018 era is very, very unlikely, if not gone already. And I base that consensus both not only on what we're seeing in terms of Washington and Beijing shifting towards a managed trade industrial policy and national security driven economic decisions, but also in preparing for the US-China-Hong Kong forum that's taking place in 2 weeks. I've been speaking to the speakers like Ambassador Baucus and asking them, what are your likely viewpoints in And what are you going to come to Hong Kong with? And, the high-level conversation that will set the tone at the very beginning will have Charlene Barszewski, who helped China so much in entering that world of free trade, is going to have Nirupama Rao, who, of course, was not only foreign secretary, but ambassador to both the United States and before that, ambassador to China, and also Professor Wang Jisi from Peking University. And I think the likely, and I don't speak for them, but certainly what the likely trend is in terms of what they're going to say is that globalization is either going or it's already dead in the water. I think this new paradigm of managed competition we're seeing is a medium-term future and likely to be one of managed competition. I think that if we break this down, Sampath, we're going to see the small yard, high fence approach from the United States, maintaining most trade, but with high tariffs, strong protections around a narrow set of technologies that are deemed critical for national security. From China's side, I think we're going to see an approach of selective engagement, where China is going to continue advocating for multilateralism and free trade in areas where it is traditionally strong, like infrastructure, like green tech, while at the same time pursuing self-reliance in weaker areas, and also a bifurcated technological landscape. So what that means, I think, in the way that I see it, is that in the critical sectors like semiconductors, AI, clean tech, we're likely to see the development of two parallel competing ecosystems, one led by the US and its allies, and then maybe one centered a little bit on China, but you can call the others. And I think what's really interesting, and Max, you spoke about social media. I think that is the perfect example of where we're seeing two parallel universes exist. The United States is a fact. China is a fact, what you talked about co-equal just now. But when you look at their social media systems and therefore the ways that they communicate within countries and within their own countries, they're both a fact, but they're operating like two train tracks going down side by side, but very, very rarely meeting. The points of intersection are fewer and fewer. They do exist, but they are fewer. But the common destination, I think, is the one that we should be very, very aware of. I spoke to a US admiral a couple of months ago, and he says that nuclear conflict is the least likely, but the most dangerous possibility. And every day we move a little bit closer to that reality, because this approach of two parallel universes, whether it be X, Twitter, Facebook on one side, WeChat, Red Note, Douyin on the other side, means that not only that their people don't communicate, but that space, that scope for understanding, for dialogue is very, very rare. So the role of US-China dialogue, like the ones that we do, but many other people do them as well, is not only about bridging fundamental ideological, in fact, I would say, is not at all about bridging ideological differences, but about creating a circuit breaker to prevent these differences from leading to the conflicts that we spoke of. We co-hosted a very small, high-level, high-quality private dialogue, track 1.5, a couple of months ago on nuclear non-proliferation. And I think this stuff really matters. I think when you get down to the brass tacks of it, it really, really is. Because we look at crisis management and we look at the structural differences that you said over here. And I just want to go back that, when we look at dialogue, it's not just about the grand policy and the grand strategy. In Hong Kong, we're going to be speaking about the impact on all of us, whether you are Sampath in Delhi, whether it's Ambassador Baucus's grandchildren in Montana, whether it's me in China, in Hong Kong, in China. What is that? That's the concern of aging in our societies, automations, how that's brought about demographic shifts, how that's placed a new question mark on the future of jobs. It looks also at dementia and other aspects of aging. It looks at trust building. How do you restore that? And for that, we have participants from India as well. So it's not just the diplomats, the scholars, though critical that they are, but also imagining this creatively through artists, through journalists, making sure that there is a free flow of ideas. And I think that's the reason why we host it here in Hong Kong. There has to be that free flow of ideas where in other parts of the world it's come to a bottleneck and sort of come to a stop.
Thank you so much for emphasizing and underscoring the importance of dialogue. in multiple tracks, James. I think Yusuf has been doing an exceptional work in this particular domain with the various initiatives, including the Hong Kong Forum as well. We have run out of time. Ambassador Baucus, unless you have some final thoughts, we can wrap up. Is there anything you would like to add here?
Well, the good news, everybody on this program is an optimist, basically. Each wants this to work. Each is trying to do his very best. And I just think we just keep that up. We keep trying to do our very best. And that's, first of all, we have no other option. But I think if we do, then we'll likely have better outcomes.
That's right. The world runs on optimism. Thank you so much, Ambassador Baucus. Thank you so much, James Chau. Pleasure talking to you both.
Good to see you, James. Good to see you, Sampath.
Thank you. Thank you.